Hey everybody, Aaron Rift here from NoDQ.com. Welcome to WCW Wednesday here on NoDQ.com. This week I'll be taking a look back at the WCW pay-per-views from 1990 and 1991. I'll be recommending matches that you should check out, and I will also be mentioning matches and segments that you should be avoiding at all costs. And by the way, speaking of costs, you can watch these pay-per-view events on the WWE Network, and as of the recording of this video, for just $9.99. Now that I got that out of the way, let's get started here. This was a transitional period in WCW, moving away from Jim Crockett Promotions and the NWA and becoming Ted Turner operated WCW. First pay-per-view we have here is Wrestle War 1990. And the first pay-per-view where you have WCW right there, smack dab at the entranceway, and their weird-ass logo where it looks like WOW. The only two matches I would recommend checking out, first match being the Rock and Roll Express against the Midnight Express. One of the best tag team feuds of the 1980s and moving forward into the early 1990s. The usual entertaining match from these two teams, and Jim Cornette at ringside, entertaining as usual. Definitely check this one out. And also you can check out the main event, Ric Flair versus Lex Luger, which was originally scheduled to be Ric Flair versus Sting, but Sting got hurt. Lex Luger made an abrupt babyface turn, and he sacrificed the world title. He got himself counted out to come to the aid of his buddy Sting. So Lex Luger clearly making a babyface turn, and Lex Luger and Sting forming that bond, best friends for life. This was entertaining stuff. Lex Luger, say what you will about him, but when he was in there with Ric Flair, maybe it's saying more about Ric Flair, but the two of them had really good matches during this time period, and I guess you could say Ric Flair could have a good match with anybody. But Lex Luger really held his own in these matches with Flair, so check this one out. And moving on here to the next pay-per-view, we have Capital Combat. A few interesting moments on this event. It was the only Capital Combat, so I mean there wasn't really all that much to write home about. And there were a few infamous moments on this show, most notably being RoboCop, the infamous appearance of RoboCop coming to the aid of Sting, who was placed inside this tiny cage by the Horsemen. So yeah, this was WCW trying to copy WWE with these very cartoonish storylines, and RoboCop coming to the aid of Sting. I mean, not much more you have to say about it. It was completely ridiculous and over the top, and a lot of old school WCW and NWA fans hated this because it was NWA and WCW trying to be like WWE. And it never quite worked out because nobody can out WWE. Yet they kept trying. But more on that later. You had Paul Ellering versus Teddy Long, hair versus hair, which, if anything, was mildly entertaining. Although, why would you have a hair versus hair match between two guys that don't really have much hair to begin with? So, who knows? Once again, Midnight Express and another entertaining tag team match against Brian Pillman and Tom Zink. It should also be noted that this was the Road Warriors' last WCW pay-per-view before jumping ship to the WWE. And the main event, Ric Flair versus Lex Luger. Once again, as I mentioned earlier, Flair able to carry Luger to a very solid match. And you had your typical Horseman antics with them lowering the steel cage and taking out Lex Luger. And also I wanted to mention Doom winning the tag team titles from the Steiners. Really good match here. One thing you can say about WCW, one positive thing about them is, you know, the tag division was really good during this period of time. You had a lot of solid tag teams, and normally you would have like 3 or 4 tag team matches on a pay-per-view. So if you're a fan of tag team wrestling, you should definitely check out WCW around this period. Next, we have the 1990 Great American Bash. Once again, some entertaining tag team matches on this show. Midnight Express versus the Southern Boys. Doom versus the Rock and Roll Express. You had the Freebirds versus the Steiners. And one thing that was interesting about this match was the crowd. I mean, the crowd was really hating on the Freebirds. There was loud chants of faggots at them. So it's a different period in wrestling. You don't hear that kind of chant now. And if you did, all hell would break loose and everybody would get offended and all that. But back then it was just the norm. And, that was something interesting that I noted when I was watching this pay-per-view event. And another interesting moment, not necessarily a good match or anything, and once again, without Ric Flair, Lex Luger is definitely exposed more. You had Lex Luger versus Mean Mark, who would go on to be The Undertaker for the U.S. title, and kind of interesting to see Mean Mark, just another lower mid-card act who puts over Lex Luger, and he would go on to be one of the biggest stars in the wrestling industry. So that was an interesting match just for that. And the main event is what people remember the most about this pay-per-view. Sting versus Ric Flair. This was Sting's first world title win. Not the best Sting versus Ric Flair match, but certainly one of the most historic matches in the history of WCW. And you had the dudes with attitudes stopping the Four Horsemen and helping Sting get the victory over Ric Flair. Very historic, so you should definitely check out that match. And, top to bottom, I mean, the tag team matches are definitely worth watching on this pay-per-view. All right, next we have the 1990 Halloween Havoc. And this show was a bit of a train wreck. This is when the whole Sting Black Scorpion storyline was going on, and they had a segment here where the Black Scorpion was doing this black magic, and it was really bad. Once again, WCW trying to be like WWE with the cartoonish storylines, and people hated it. And it was really cheesy. It felt like a bad high school play, let's just put it that way. So you might want to avoid this. This was Jim Cornette's last pay-per-view in WCW. A few other noteworthy moments. Nasty Boys versus the Steiners. The Nasty Boys had come in. This was their first WCW pay-per-view, and it would be their last for a while because they would jump ship to WWE. So once again, WCW missing out on a wrestler or a tag team that has potential. Same thing with Mean Mark. They had him, they let him go. He went to WWE and became a huge star. And you had Doom versus Ric Flair and Arn Anderson. One of the few times during this period, actually I think the only pay-per-view where Ric Flair was in a tag team match and not in the main event or a high-profile match, the main event. This match was very entertaining. The only bad thing about it was it ended in a double count-out. I guess they didn't want to put over one team over the other, but, Doom was really on a roll during this period, and certainly their feud with the Horsemen was one of the highlights of 1990. And then you had the main event, which was quite a bit of a train wreck. Sting versus Sid. You had the first ever occurrence of a fake Sting, which would be a running theme in WCW for many years to come. You had Barry Windham dressed up as Sting, and they tried to cheat Sting out of the title, but he came back out, and it was a bit over the top and goofy. But this was what WCW was becoming. They were trying more and more to emulate the WWE, and a lot of fans got turned off by it. Next, we have Starrcade. I really wasn't a big fan of this pay-per-view. It was an international... The whole theme of the show was an international tag team tournament. And to me, it was too many tag team matches. I'm all for tag team wrestling, but when the whole show is built around nothing but tag team matches, it can get old very quick. And most of the matches were very forgettable, not that good. The only match that I would make note of in the tag team tournament, you had Chris Adams and Norman Smiley, who would go on many years later to be Screaming Norman Smiley during the end of WCW, against Rey Mysterio, not the Rey Mysterio we know, but his uncle, Rey Mysterio Sr., and Conan. So I thought that this was just an interesting tag team match from a historical standpoint. Everything else, you could really skip over. You had the Horsemen against Doom in a street fight, and I actually thought that this was a really good match. This is one I would definitely recommend. Doom against Arn Anderson and Barry Windham. Really physical match, very intense. The only thing I didn't like was the finish. Once again, WCW not willing to beat either team, so they do a lame double count-out finish. Both teams get counted out once again. But besides that, I mean, the match was really good, and these two teams just beat the hell out of each other. And it's a match that definitely holds up to today's standards. And finally, you had Sting versus Scorpion. Match wasn't that bad because it was Ric Flair under the mask. The storyline was lame, but I mean, the match was good, and they did have the big reveal at the end that it was Flair. So thankfully, that storyline was finally put to pasture. Moving on to 1991, we have Wrestle War 91. This was Dusty Rhodes' first pay-per-view back. The most notable thing about this pay-per-view, a few things. You had Doom finally having their big split after a very solid run throughout 1990. And then you had Dustin Rhodes making his first WCW appearance against Buddy Landau. But the best match of the show easily was the War Games match, the Horsemen against Team Sting. Really good War Games match. Definitely would recommend you checking that one out. And Sid doing this power bomb to Brian Pillman where he basically dumps him on his head and neck. I mean, it was really brutal. So definitely check that one out. Moving on here to the very first Super Brawl, Super Brawl 1. This pay-per-view was very much a mixed bag. You had a lot of debuts. You had the debut of Johnny B. Bad, Mark Marrow making his first appearance with that character. And then you had one of the most notorious debuts of all time, Kevin Nash debuting as Oz. And going back to earlier, WCW trying to do these cartoonish characters and storylines, trying to emulate WWE. The less said about Oz, the better. But it was quite the train wreck to watch, and you might just want to check it out from a historical standpoint, just to see Kevin Nash doing this completely ridiculous character. You had the Steiners versus Luger and Sting. That was a very good match, probably the best match of the show. You had Sid's last match in WCW before jumping to WWE against El Gigante. Terrible match. It only went about 2 minutes, and it was a stretcher match, and Sid basically was put on the stretcher, and then he just walked away, and that was the end of it. It was really lame. Ric Flair versus Tatsumi Fujinami. Decent match. I thought it was kind of boring personally, but it was Ric Flair's last pay-per-view match before going to WWE, so it does have some historical significance. And one match I really enjoyed on the show also was Barry Windham versus Brian Pillman taped fist match. These two worked really well together, so I would recommend that one as well. Next, we have the 1991 Great American Bash. A lot of fans would consider this to be the worst WCW pay-per-view of its time. Certainly at the time, people thought it was the worst pay-per-view from WCW or WWE, any promotion of all time. I don't think it's the worst pay-per-view. I've seen a lot of bad pay-per-views since then, but certainly I would agree with the sentiment that it was the worst pay-per-view of its time. This was right after Ric Flair left, so the crowd was very negative on the show. They were chanting, "We want Flair" through the entire thing. And the show started off with one of the worst matches of all time. And this is a bad match by any standard, any time period. This is just one of the all-time worst matches ever. A scaffold match with Steve Austin and Terry Taylor against Beautiful Bobby and PN News. Who would book PN News to be in a scaffold match? What were they thinking with that? And I guess they figured since nobody was going to take a crazy bump to the bottom, that they decided to make it a capture the flag match. So basically, one team had to cross the scaffold and get to the other side and get the flag. This was so bad. And the crowd was so dead you could hear a pin drop. It was one of the worst things you'll ever see. So if you want to feel like torturing yourself, then you could check out this match. And the rest of the card, I mean, it was just very mediocre. I mean, there was really nothing memorable on this pay-per-view. And then you had the main event, Lex Luger versus Barry Windham. Once again, the crowd wanted to see Ric Flair. It wasn't a bad match or anything, but the crowd just didn't care about it. Lex Luger turned heel. He aligned himself with Harley Race and became the new heel champion. But yeah, it wasn't what the fans wanted. So this pay-per-view, really the only match I would recommend checking out is the scaffold match if you want to watch something that's really bad. If you want to watch the train wreck of train wrecks, then, check that one out. All right, moving on here, we have the 1991 edition of Halloween Havoc. Once again, the most notable thing about this pay-per-view was one of the worst matches of all time. Another terrible match, the Chamber of Horrors. How could you have a match with so many talented guys? Sting, the Steiners, Cactus Jack, Scott Hall, Vader, and have it be so horrific. Basically, the object was to electrocute somebody in an electric chair. And the worst thing about this match was they had a lever on the outside. You had to push the lever down to set up the electric chair and have the electricity go through. But the problem is that the lever fell during the match. So you had Cactus Jack out there trying to push the lever back up. It was just so stupid. And then you had Abdullah the Butcher getting electrocuted. And then moments later, he was back fighting and on his feet. It was just, I mean, who came up with this? What were they thinking? Just so awful that I would actually recommend watching it just because you can laugh at it. It's like the Plan 9 from outer space of professional wrestling. And the other noteworthy thing on this show was the debut of Rick Rude. So, this was his big debut in WCW, and he would go on to have a very solid run. So you could check out his debut, but everything else on this show you could pretty much avoid. Nothing really noteworthy on this pay-per-view. And finally, the last WCW pay-per-view of 1991, Starrcade. This was the first Battle Bowl, the Lethal Lottery, where you had random teams competing. Going back to the previous Starrcade, the same issue I had with this one, just too many tag team matches. I actually like the concept of the Lethal Lottery. That's why I've been doing it on NoDQ.com with the fantasy tournament. But just every match being a tag team match and the same storyline where two guys that don't like each other are forced to wrestle. It just got very old very quick. And not to mention that the matches were very bad as well. The only interesting thing during this Lethal Lottery was the interaction between Cactus Jack and Abdullah the Butcher. Besides that, extremely mediocre, forgettable matches. The end, I thought, was entertaining with Sting and Luger. This was the setup for Sting versus Lex Luger at Super Brawl in 1992, and I thought that this was well done, at least to build up Sting as the #1 contender and have him beat Lex Luger to win Battle Bowl and get the title shot. So I thought that that was well done. Everything else, definite thumbs down. So there you have it, my thoughts on the WCW pay-per-views from 1990 and 1991. Stay tuned. Next time on WCW Wednesday, I will take a look at 1992 and 1993 WCW pay-per-views. Thanks for watching.